Hey guys, I'm Dav, and today I've got a very special video for you all. Here with me today we've got our very own AEROCRASTIC, a participant of the ever-chosen Invitational. Took fourth this place around, a previous champion. He's been playing a bunch of games with the new DLC, as have I, and so we're kind of getting together to share our thoughts about the new DLC, sort of how things fit into the meta, and to give you guys some nice eye candy in the background. We've got some battles that we've just fought. So yeah, we're going to get started with the Skaven, just sort of talking generally about how the new additions change them as a faction. So AEROCRASTIC, how would you say the new additions change how you approach playing as the Skaven?
Hi, Dav. Thanks for having me here today. So, in general, I think that the Skaven playstyle won't change a whole lot. You still, of course, will have to manage the relatively poor leadership of your units, and also the adjustment to summons has, I think, made playing with them a little bit more nuanced for factions that have access to them, from manticores to zombie summons, and then, of course, clan rats in this case. I'll say that they did get a few more options for long-range combat, and of course, since everyone knows that warp lightning cannons in particular are so poor at counter battery fire, now Jezzails can fit the role of countering other factions' artillery. So I think that the Skaven playstyle is going to become a little bit more dynamic, but I also believe that the faction as a whole is going to remain fairly difficult to play for a lot of people.
Yeah, in my experience, the multi-layered approach is still definitely how you want to play the Skaven, and, summons are still very important. It does definitely change, I agree, especially with the higher value summons like the Plague Monks. I actually haven't played a game with the Dreaded 13th with the new change, but I'd imagine it's about the same. Granted, you get a big damage burst out of that one, so you can generate some value that way. But with the Plague Monks especially, you really have to time it and get them into the right situation. Like, if you just kind of summon them out in the open, to try and, just put them on whatever, which you could kind of do before. Now, because of the timing mechanic, you really have to make sure you put them in the right place at the right time. And I think that does add a new dynamic, certainly. But yeah, the Jezzails, I think, are, at least in my experience, sort of the real gem here. Ikit himself is a gem as well. But the Jezzails just mean that you really have more options for taking down big terror-causing monsters, which was one of the biggest weaknesses of Skaven. Obviously, with the poor leadership, the terror is a big issue. Now, having the tools to quickly burst down those big monsters means that in a lot of situations, you're not going to run into as many issues with terror. What do you think?
Yes, I completely agree with you there. Of course, against factions that are undead, I believe Skaven will still have their work cut out for them. But when it comes to, for example, like the Lizardmen matchup even, just the fact that you don't have to take just warp lightning cannons, but the fact that you can mix it up between Rattling gunners, between Jezzails, between a variety of other missiles, where before all you had were just, Wither, Death Runner, Slinger combinations to try to nuke the armor of something big and then hopefully burst it down in a meaningful amount of time. So I think that having all of these other firing options, more options for ranged combat, gives Skaven a little bit more of a fluid playstyle when it comes to dealing with terror.
Definitely. And on the subject of terror, having a Lord that's mobile, does good armor-piercing damage, has good area of effect damage spells, and just general good utility spells, and also causes terror, of course, Ikit with his Doom Wheel, I think is a powerful tool for this Skaven as well, because, previously the double Doom Wheel builds were pretty good. Now you can, fold that Doom Wheel into your Lord, get some extra tools. His missile attack, as you saw in this game, is pretty powerful. And, of course, having Lore of Ruin, Howling Warp Gale is just an excellent utility spell in general. Warp Lightning and Death Frenzy are both excellent utility spells also. So I think Ikit definitely adds another viable Lord choice. There were some matchups where you might want to take Queek or Tretch before, but Skrolk was really the go-to in most matchups. Now Ikit Claw kind of gives you another option that's going to be viable in a multitude of matchups, especially factions that may struggle against like heavily armored single entities or chariots. Either of those, Ikit Claw definitely gives you a good option there. And of course, the Regiment of Renown Doom Wheel being one of the coolest looking new units in my opinion. Both of them just look absolutely amazing. Yeah. Other thoughts on the Skaven Rattling Gunners? That's an interesting one. I'd like to know your experience on that unit. I've had some mixed results, but what's been your experience with the Rattling Gunners?
So for the time being at least, I don't think that Rattling Gunners are a particularly amazing unit. To me, they seem a little bit like Warp Fire Throwers that are a little less lethal, but trade that for some more range. The fact that they have that suppression debuff that lowers speed is a big deal. As was seen in one of the Ever Chosen matches, to me, like one of the very first glaring synergies I thought with them was that maybe you could pair them with poison gutter runners, stack the slow from poison along with snare nets, and then on top of that suppress units to get them running at extremely slow speeds. Of course, it didn't quite work out so well for me because the lethality of Rattling Gunners is a bit questionable at times, but I have my faith in CA that they'll do what needs to be done to make it a comparable unit.
Yeah, it's interesting. The lethality is one thing I've noticed, especially at the extreme ends of their range. Once you get within about half range or so, they will just mow a unit down for the most part. But especially towards the extreme end of the range, I have noticed that the stopping power isn't quite what you would expect. It is sort of an interesting suppression, almost like a psychological suppression for the other player too, if they're not super experienced. Like the first time I faced them, it's very glaringly obvious that you're being shot at by a lot of things, and it's kind of like, oh no, I need to pull out real quick because that looks dangerous, when in fact it's not actually that dangerous. It just more looks really flashy. But the suppression mechanic is one. I have played against a couple of more rush style builds, like the greenskins in particular, where the suppression mechanic did keep a few units from even getting into contact with my front line of Skaven slaves, just because they were taking so much fire. I think it was some Savage Orcs in particular, but yeah, it's an interesting unit. I like the comparison with Warp Fire Throwers. I think they're maybe a little bit better. Granted, they are a bit more expensive as well, but I do think that, yeah, they're not quite as much of an auto pick as the Jezzails. I think Jezzails are going to be something you see in almost every matchup, whereas the Rattling Gunners are going to be a bit more niche. Yeah, certainly a fun unit, but I don't think they're necessarily amazing. And then, just in terms of the regiments of renown, obviously the clan rats being cheap are probably going to get a lot of use just because of their price, but what other regiments of renown do you think really stand out as being super useful?
Well, I'd say just about any time you want Jezzails, which is probably almost all the time, the Regiment of Renown Jezzail definitely sticks out to me. Natty Bubo's sharpshooters. Romulan's got me got me a little bit tongue-tied. He's been calling them Natty Boo-Boos sharpshooters, so. But yeah, just having stalk and snipe on a unit of Jezzails is just, I mean, it's also very thematic, right? Unit of snipers that hides and shoots, but at the same time, it's also, of course, very deadly.
Yeah, because at least in my experience, the counterfire, like if you have a artillery piece that's reasonably decent at counterfire, long range especially, it can be, tough to make the Jezzails work just because they tend to get blown up by those long range artillery pieces. But of course, Natty Boobos, they're not going to get spotted. They'll stay hidden at that long range and just be able to rain fire. So yeah, I definitely agree. I would say, of course, the Regiment of Renown Doomwheel, it's just a Doomwheel with better stats, and the Zap Gun does a bit more damage. So I mean, that's useful in and of itself. I don't know if it's necessarily a lot better than just taking a regular Doomwheel, but for some matchups in particular, I would say the Regiment of Renown Warp Lightning Cannon, that plus 10 ability recharge, like obviously Greenskins, that's a hard counter to their faction mechanics, so you obviously want to take it pretty much every time in that matchup. But I'm thinking for a lot of the factions that require a lot of ability uptime or magic, like your vampire counts, high elves, those types of factions that really rely on that, it's going to be a great pick in those matchups as well.
Well, I think I might actually slightly disagree with you here, and the reason for that being is that most of the time the abilities that you want to be setting on cooldown are attached to the character's lords, but oftentimes the unit that you're most concerned with firing at with your Warp Lightning Cannons tends to be cavalry or something other than that. So if you were, for example, to take, let's say, 3 Warp Lightning Cannons, and one of them was trained on the enemy lord and 2 of them were trained on their cavalry, that's a significant decrease in DPS on, I'll say, their win condition. Whereas with the normal warp lightning cannons, you would still, of course, be shooting at the cavalry. So I feel like even in the matchups that it might be useful or it might look a little bit useful, I feel like it's perhaps a little bit overstated, since most of the time you don't actually want to be shooting their lord that early, at least.
That is a good point. And I mean, most people are going to very quickly learn that you don't want to take any kind of big monster lord against the Skaven, just because of, their newfound firepower means that single entity monsters are at a huge risk against them. So very typically, like in our matchup, for example, you took Sigvald, which is a really interesting pick. Previously Sigvald may have seen only a few niche matchups, but I do like that pick because, obviously he's fairly snipe proof. But yeah, I do see your point about them being more efficient shooting at cavalry. I actually had a conundrum like that in one of my games. I don't remember exactly who, but it was like, okay, I need to be shooting. I want to say it was a game against Italian Spartacus against the Dark Elves. Like, okay, I need to be shooting, these cavalry that are threatening my backline, but at the same time, like, I want to shoot Malekith to make sure he can't cast spells, right? So there is a bit of a choice to be made there. But being that it's only 200 points more expensive than a regular warp lightning cannon, I would say if you're going to take one, it may be worth taking that one, just for the fact that it has faster fire rate and is more accurate, being Regiment of Renown. But the ability recharge time does sort of force you into a decision where you may not necessarily use it as efficiently as you could in a given situation. But I would say certainly, at least for the greenskins, until they change WA to not be a not melee conditional recharge, it's probably worth it even if you just shoot the enemy lord once at the beginning of the battle, just to keep them from using that on the charge. But it's certainly an interesting one. And
Yeah, for sure.
The more expensive infantry, the Council Guard, I'm not super sold on. Same thing with Censer Bearers in general, I'm just not super sold on. So I think having a Regiment of Renown, an even more expensive glass cannon unit isn't necessarily the best, but I don't know. What do you think about the two more expensive infantry?
Well, to me, the Regiment of Renown Council Guard screams out to me some sort of degeneration blob. Just by merit of the fact that all of Skaven's degen tools are tied to lords or heroes, like Kroak or Plague Priests on Plague Furnaces, Warlock Engineers with Warp Shard Armor, and they, of course, all benefit from having that Guardian from the Council Guard. But in addition to that, it's also an unbreakable halberd unit. So the fact that they will provide that constant buffer from for your leadership to the last rat man, I think could be very valuable there. Definitely not something I'm looking forward to, but we'll see how the meta evolves in that respect.
Yeah, the point about Kroak, I think, is interesting because he can be a little bit goonable. He's not the most tanky character in the world, so I think, especially in support of him, I think that they'll definitely have a place there. Ikits, because he's so, well, if he's on the Doom Wheel at least, he's pretty mobile, so I don't know that necessarily he'll get the best value, but the Plague Priest, especially up on the Bell, or on the Plague Furnace, rather. Yeah, that sounds pretty gross, but I think that's just about it for the Skaven, unless you had any other final thoughts, if we missed anything.
I think we've pretty much covered everything.
All right, well, then we'll move on to what's on screen currently, the Lizard Boys, the scaly ones. They've got plenty of new tools. In terms of new stuff, I don't think that they necessarily got quite as much as the Skaven, but some of the tools they did get, their characters in particular, I think, are really the strong part. Now, obviously, we haven't seen a lot of Tic-Tac-Toe yet, so I can't really comment on him too much. But in terms of the other characters, Tehenowin is obviously a very strong character in a multitude of situations. So I guess we can kind of talk about him first. Lore of Beasts, obviously, a number of different mount choices. What matchups do you think that you'll see Tehenowin in?
Well, since we haven't seen much of Tic-Tac-Toe yet, it's a little bit difficult to see whether or not he and Tehenowin are going to be playing a tie with each other. But I believe Tehenuin would probably see the most use against, I'd like to say, High Elves, perhaps Vampire Counts. I think he could also be quite good against Norska, and also against Wood Elves.
Interesting. Wood elves. Now, what kind of loadout would you take again in that matchup?
So for the Wood Elf matchup, at least, oftentimes the bane of the Lizardmen has just been being incapable of catching the Wood Elf skirmishers, and then you just kind of die under the weight of four-way watchers or Blade Guard with Starfire chefs, or whatever it is that they decide to take. But this kind of goes in hand with the expansion of their roster, and also the changes to Rampage that I think Tehenuin, with the Blade of the Serpent's Tongue, with Amber Spear, and with the modified Manticore summons, that he could provide a lot of very useful disruption. And then, of course, imbuing poison into his allies could allow things like Horned Ones or even Cold One Spear Riders to beat out Wild Riders in a pretty timely fashion.
Interesting. Yeah, the poison buffing the Lizardman Cav. That's something I had not even really thought about. Granted, I haven't. That's one matchup I have not played. But that's definitely a very interesting thought. Have to play around with that a little bit more. And that, I guess, that AoE poison effect is really one of his strongest suits, because you can give any unit on the Lizardman roster poison attacks, which just opens up so many options, because oftentimes like the lack of mobility is really the issue, like you said. So
Right.
So, yeah, in terms of the one thing I did notice, the red-crested skink chief didn't see any use in the Ever-Chosen Invitational, but he has a melee attack buff that makes his combat stats absolutely ridiculous. And you can take him on, is it an Ancient Stegodon or an Engine of the Gods, one of the two? Now, that kind of monster with, like, crazy, I think it's like a plus 44 melee attack buff.
Yes.
I was surprised, that once I saw that he had that no one had taken that in the Ever-Chosen Invitational, because it seemed like that would be super broken in some matchups, but I guess maybe it just never got the opportunity to be shown, huh?
I think when it comes to the Ever-Chosen, at least, since we've had the patch for such a short period of time, and of course some of us are also occupied in our daily lives, so we can't always commit as much time as we would like to practicing some of these matchups. I think that he just kind of got slept over because everyone was looking at all the other flashy Lord choices like Tehenuin, and then also the fact that Rampage got changed so drastically, and then also between synergies between, say, Kroak's Hand of the Gods and Ancient Salamanders, and all this other all of these other very dynamic playstyles for the Lizardmen that just this one buff skink kind of got left by the wayside. But I think he could definitely be pretty viable, also very dangerous in a variety of matchups.
Yeah, I do think so, and I mean he's pretty versatile as well, because I mean you can take him on foot, and he has those great combat stats. He's anti-large, doesn't have a missile block chance, but he's a small target, and he's pretty cheap. He's less than 1,000 points, so that allows you to go very, very wide and heavily invest in some other areas. So I definitely think that he's going to be kind of a hidden gem of some of the new stuff, and I definitely wanted to highlight that boy. But the other character, of course, Lord Kroak, he is free LC, so everybody gets him. But he's definitely one that, he's a hero with Greater Arcane Conduit, which means you can stack two characters with Greater Arcane Conduit if you take, Mazdamundi or another Slann, as well as Lord Kroak. And, of course, his Deliverance of It's a Spell does hilarious amounts of damage to infantry and cavalry. I've been blown up by that several times already, and it is very, very painful. But he does have some interesting aspects in that he does have heavy missile and magic resistance. So, I think it's like 60% missile resistance, something like that. So shooting at him is not necessarily the best way of dealing with him. He is flammable, so, flaming attacks can do a lot of damage to him. But, I don't know. What do you think about Lord Kroak? What's your impression of him?
Well, so far I'm not sure if he's been dialed down at all, but I actually felt, at least during the Ever-Chosen, that he was a little bit overpowered, if you will. Of course, since we only had so so much time to play around with him, it's kind of hard to tell. But just the fact that Deliverance of Itza has granted a long wind-up, and you can see it coming from a mile away. But when it does hit, I mean, it is essentially a vortex that doesn't damage friendly troops. So you could use it in very disadvantageous situations for you normally, like if you were to have Cold One Spear Riders fighting Grail Knights, and then you just drop the Deliverance of Itza on the Grail Knights. Well, now the Bretonnian player, has a bit of a conundrum ahead of him. Now, does he stay in combat with the Cold One Spear Riders that he will beat and just eat the Deliverance of Itza? Probably a bad idea. Or does he run away from it and then take constant hits in the back? And with Vortex spells now, you would risk friendly fire, but because Deliverance of Itza doesn't do that, you can actually chase him and continue getting those rear attacks until the spell goes off, and then retreat from combat, and then, rinse and repeat.
Yeah, it's definitely that forcing that lose-lose choice for your opponent, right? And like I had a game against Lore Master of Sotek where, the builds factions with, elite infantry especially, where you've been relying on that to beat the Lizardmen, it's going to be really tough to make that work, just because the threat of Lord Kroak, I mean, even if they don't end up bringing him, but just the threat of the fact that they could bring him, I mean, it makes bringing elite infantry almost unviable. And I mean, I didn't pull it off super well in the game that we played, but having that the nets from Mazda Mundi along with the Deliverance, you've got the double Greater Arcane Conduit, could potentially be really, really nasty to set up for some just crazy synergies there. But yeah. I think that they do need to tone down the damage just a little bit. Maybe make it so that the AP scales for the 3 different versions. So like the base one maybe won't do as much damage to armored units. Maybe it'll do a little bit, but not. It'll do more to unarmored units, obviously. But just but then as it scales up, it does successively more AP, so it sort of forces a choice, right, where you only want to use the high-end version. It'll cost a lot of Winds of Magic, but you have to use that to really, delete an expensive elite unit, whereas the cheaper version, you could spam more and use it to clear out chaff, whereas using on elites wouldn't be as efficient. I don't know, what do you think? Would that be a reasonable change?
Well, it's actually already a bit like that, but the problem to me is that as you go up each tier of Deliverance of Itza, for some reason, the radius of the spell also grows larger. So as you have this giant, you have this AP blast in the 3rd tier, but it's this huge radius that covers, I'd like to say, maybe like half the distance of like a Soul Blight or another similar hex spell. So it becomes both very difficult to avoid and then also incredibly lethal on top of that. Had I brought a unit of Chosen with halberds, for example, as a lot of people like to do against Lizardmen, that unit would have absolutely been toast.
Oh yeah. Like the match I had against Lore Master of Sotek, which I was showing on the background just a little bit ago, I had a unit of Chosen, 2 units of Chosen with shields that I had brought without thinking about it, and yeah, they got deleted pretty hard. But yeah, Lord Kroak, I do think that maybe he needs a couple more balance tweaks before release, but we'll see how powerful he is. Granted, guys, a lot of this could change before the release build. It's probably not likely to change too much. I think things are generally in a pretty good place, but could be some fine-tuning here and there, and I do think Lord Kroak they maybe ought to have a look at again. In terms of the other Lizardman stuff, the new dinosaur variants, Engine of the Gods is pretty decent. The power recharge rate thing is nice. I found that the orbital bombardment just takes a little bit too long to wind up. It's very easy to dodge because it's very obvious what's happening, but it certainly looks cool. And the fact that you get the extra power recharge rate means that it's a nice option. I don't know that you would necessarily bring one in a regular situation, but as a mount option, for example, for Tehenuin, it's obviously going to be a decent pick. The Ark of Sotek, it's a little bit of a weird one. The vortex thing that it drops doesn't do a whole lot of damage. It does imbue poison, but I don't know. It's just kind of a little bit of a strange one. What do you think? Have you found a specific use for it?
I mean, It's a little bit hard to say how useful it is, really, because there is also the Feral Bastillodon at just, I believe, 450 less, which more or less does the same thing. Now, we were told that the Vortex for the Ark of Sotek is supposed to be very damaging towards lightly armored units, which would make the Ark of Sotek a great chaff clearer, but at the same time, again, there's the Feral Bastillodon at 450 points less, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. I believe we'll have to wait and see how the meta develops before, making a judgment on whether or not the 450 is worth it. But I'd say for the time being, I'm going to give it a wait and see, and we'll have to go from there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that assessment. Yeah, the regiments of renown for the Lizardmen. I'm just thinking they didn't really get, besides, I guess, the salamanders. We can kind of talk about them as well. The salamander hunting pack, we kind of talked about this in the chat after the game, but I had brought a couple units. I couldn't really make them work because you happened to bring some Chaos Knights that were able to catch them and shut them down. Even if you hadn't brought them, I probably would have had some issues with your Hounds and your Marauder Horsemen anyway. But yeah, they do seem to be a unit that is they're definitely good in some niche situations. I had a game against Black Iron's Greenskins where they did very, very well in taking out some Orc Boarboy Biggins and doing a ton of damage to an Ragnarok Spider. But they just seem to be, I don't know, they're in a weird place. What do you think?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to make a judgment on them. Generally speaking, I'd like to compare them to, say, a unit of Trollhammers, but with 70 speed instead of 20-something or whatever it is that Trollhammers have. I mean, for the most part, it's a unit of Feral Cold Ones that happens to have flaming attacks and, has Trollhammers on their back. But, I mean, the fact that they're so fragile and have relatively low range to me is kind of what seals the deal for them. I'm not sure if they'll be useful in very many matchups, but I mean, anytime the fire damage is relevant, I suppose you could probably get something out of them against vampire counts, for example.
Yeah, maybe vampire counts, maybe Norska, factions that maybe don't necessarily have the mobility to catch them. I would say dwarves, but I think that they're going to suffer from that low range you mentioned. And they're just going to face a lot of counterfire because obviously dwarfs are going to bring armor-piercing missiles against the Lizardmen, and that's going to be a good counter for the salamanders. The ancient salamander as well. I mean, there is some good synergy to be had with the flammable effect. It does give you another slow, so you can kind of layer that on top of the poison to really debuff, certain units to be very, very slow. But I don't know. Just in general, I haven't really found a great role. It seems like a lot of the Lizardman stuff is cool, but it maybe doesn't have a super well-defined role. We'll have to kind of wait and see. I think the Lizardman, the new monsters especially, we're going to have to kind of, I don't know, mess around with a little bit more, get to know the nuance of exactly how everything works. Like you mentioned, like layering it with Hand of the Gods, since that does fire damage, maybe you take an Ancient Salamander and like 2 Solar Engines, to try and get more value out of them. There's some different things that you could do, but I think it definitely bears some more experimentation, and just the small sample size of games that we've got so far, I don't think is really enough to prove exactly where they'll fit. But in terms of the regiments of renown, let's see. I'm trying to think through what exactly the Lizardmen have. Temple Guard are one that I've used them. They seem pretty decent. I don't know. Temple Guard are a unit that can be good. They can sometimes not be super cost efficient. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, Temple Guard on their own, I think they're a pretty good halberd unit. I know Turin has many times mentioned that they have a slightly faster attack speed than most other halberd units, making them kind of like a great weapon hybrid. But of course, I think the most important thing for the Lizardmen was having some sort of access to magic attacks, and the fact that the Star Chamber Guardians have magic attacks is a huge deal for Lizardmen, I think, because now they can actually threaten to do something against ethereal units or against physical resistance stacking that before their options were fairly limited against.
That is a good point. That is a very good point. Yeah, the ethereal units, I'm just showing a game in the background. Well, I was earlier. where I took vampire counts and took 2 banshees. My opponent had the lizardmen. He did not have the Star Chamber Guardians, unfortunately, which would have been great for taking down those banshees. But yeah, the magic attacks for them, very, very important. The Guardians, always nice to have, especially for, expensive characters like Mazdamundi, or, if you kit out to Henowin on the Engine of the Gods, he can get quite expensive as well. So, having that elite defense definitely helps. For the other regiments for now, the Thunderous one, the random Uranan's Thunderbolt is nice. I haven't found it to be, it seems like it, just because RNGesus hates all of us, it sometimes will just, go off randomly. Like if it's in a big blob, it'll hit the one spot of the blob where there's no unit models standing. But in general, I don't know, Ancient Stegodons are already good in some matchups, but I haven't found that one to be necessarily a lot better value. What do you think?
I mean, this Ancient Stegodon concerns me quite a bit personally. Of course, the lightning strike that it does is a little bit unreliable at times, but the way I like to see it is that this Stegodon is more or less a glorified Mortis engine. Just instead of regenerating, it's got 140 armor and pretty comparable melee stats. There were a couple of games that I played with and against it where I was trying to pin it down and kill it with things like Horned Ones, Cold One Cavalry, Cold One Knights, the Regiment of Renown Bestigors, and it just straight up, pounded straight through them. It's the kind of unit that normally you would think, oh, you counter monsters by surrounding them and poking them to death with a million little spears, but the Thunderous one, that does not work out so well for you if you opt for that. You have to kind of duel it one-on-one.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I've actually been in a game where it's lost. I don't know. I haven't seen it in that many games personally, but in one game, it wasn't the Thunderous one, but I did have to take down a Skink Chief on the Stegodon. And, being that I knew about his melee attack buff, I didn't want to get involved in melee with him, so I ended up using Plague of Rust and the Weird Spawn and stacking armor debuffs and just throwing javelins at him until he fell over, which ended up working out okay. Even though I didn't win the battle, I was able to take him down. But, yeah, I mean, granted, if he had the Thunderous one in that battle, and I used up all my steam, going after the red-crested Skink Chief, and the Thunderous one then ran over my face. So, yeah, I think the melee defense part, because it's a Regiment of Renown, it has, pretty high melee defense, right? And so even, semi-elite, mid-tier units will have a hard time making consistent contact. And because it's constantly charging around, the Stegodon's animations are very active. It's constantly, throwing guys around, staggering them, not allowing them to get attacks in the first place. I definitely think that it could be potentially problematic. Again, I haven't had too much personal experience. I've only seen it in a couple of games so far. But, yeah, we'll see. It certainly for factions like the Greenskins, it's going to be a huge pain to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. Greenskins, I also see it being a problem for Beastmen. Potentially Chaos as well. Just from an issue of, I suppose, running out of ammunition to deal with it, and from there only really having Shaggoths as a reliable answer. But I think that the Lizardmen counterplay to Shaggoths has also improved a little bit, so we'll have to see how that changes. Definitely.
And almost forgot about the boys themselves, the red-crested skinks, another kind of mid-tier infantry unit for the Lizardmen at 575. In my experience, you don't want to necessarily put them in a head-up engagement. They're not necessarily meant for that, but, having great weapons, poison, frenzy, they're decent enough, and just having another cheaper infantry unit, I think, fills a nice niche for the Lizardmen. The Regiment of Renown version, of course, unbreakable, which makes them extra useful, and that refuse to die, if you can pop that before they lose too many unit models, and then maybe throw a heal on as well, you can actually make these guys surprisingly tanky, given that they have pretty poor melee defense and armor. What do you think? I personally really like the red-crested skinks, just as another kind of utility option.
I think they're a great addition to the Lizardmen roster. I mean, for one, it's one step in making the roster as a whole a little bit faster. And I think that's something that a lot of people underestimate in a faction's viability and how their strengths and weaknesses kind of play into their matchups is faction speed. Like Chaos is normally a very easy faction for people to kite because the majority of their units are particularly slow, and the ones that are fast are relatively fragile. So, with regards to Lizardmen, of course, before all you had for infantry, let's be honest, were pretty much just Saurus, right?
Yeah.
But just the fact that you can now threaten to go particularly wide with red crested skinks, or mix them into a Saurus core, put AP, put poison on the front line. It's a fast unit which offers the Lizardmen very nice utility, and I think minus the smoke bomb ability, they'll be fairly comparable to like the greenskins as nasty skulkers.
Right. Yeah, I actually really like that comparison because nasty skulkers don't have poison attacks, but they do have the smoke bomb, which is obviously a higher percentage speed debuff. It makes them a lot slower, but it's only for a short period of time, and it's something that you have to actively use, right? You have to remember to click through the units and use them. Whereas the red-crested skinks have poison. Obviously, it's not as big of a speed debuff, but it's passive. They're just going to do it every time they hit, right? So I really like that comparison, actually. I think they're a very, very comparable unit, definitely. And I already myself have used them in a few games, like dwarfs in particular. Just having another cheap AP infantry to layer in, rear charge, just overwhelm the dwarf lines. It gives you a really good option in what was previously a really tough matchup. I think the red crested skinks bring that matchup a lot more even, certainly. What do you think?
Yep, I would agree with that completely. Also, the buffs to drop the rocks from pterodons. If you don't mind me branching into that.
Oh
now.
yeah, go for it. I've been rained on a few times, so yeah, go
Yeah,
for it.
so we saw in the Everchosen, of course, in the game between Felcon and Indie Pride, Lizardman versus Skaven, of course, he brought in this little hit squad of pterodons and just completely nuked the warp lightning cannon with a single volley of rocks. And of course, you can also do the same thing to dwarves because just the overall lethality of these dropped rocks has been increased exponentially, making them not too much unlike maybe a gyro bomber payload. Honestly, they're pretty strong.
Yeah,
So
it definitely seems that they are buffed, and I mean, especially like the Regiment of Renown, for example, you get armor sundering as well. So like you drop these guys first, and then you come in with the second group and drop theirs. They're gonna do even more damage, and just in general, they are much improved. So I'm definitely liking that addition for sure. It makes these guys, just be able to get their value a little bit easier, because they are relatively squishy. A little bit of counterfire and they'll usually, go away relatively quickly. But if you can get in, get a quick drop rocks, even if you don't use all your javelins, you can still generate enough value.
right. And of course, the armor sundering from the Regiment of Renown also pairs quite well with the Fire Leech Bola version of Pterodon. So, I mean, there's a lot that can be done.
Absolutely, yeah, because they don't necessarily have the best AP, but if you can sunder that armor, especially given a unit that's kind of in that like 70 to 90 range, you'll get a lot more value out of these Fire Leech Bolas for sure. And just in general, like Saurus have 50 weapon strength. Granted, not that much of it is armor piercing, but just in general, that armor sundering is gonna synergize with a lot of different Lizardmen units, certainly. And then, of course, we've got the Ripperdactyl Riders, a powerful flying unit. I have had my face torn up by these guys a few times. You've got the anti-large version, the Colossedon Hunters. They are pretty expensive at 1,500. For a unit that only has 31 melee defense and 45 armor. Relatively low HP as well at 4,200. They're pretty squishy, but they can do a crazy amount of damage.
Yeah, I really like the inclusion of the Ripperdactyl Riders for Lizardmen. Just the fact that they have somewhat of an aerial presence. I mean, granted, it's not quite as powerful as, let's say, High Elves or Wood Elves, for example, that have much more threatening missiles on the ground and in the air, and as well as a bunch of Net and Tempest abilities that are easy to access. But the fact that these units are kind of fulfill this sort of glass cannony roll. I mean, maybe like Hawk Riders, where you take away the missile attacks and then you just juice up their melee stats and you get Ripperdactyl Riders. Um, I think is a very nice addition, and they also really do a number to units like Blood Knights. Actually, if you just swarm them with a bunch of Rippers, they melt very quickly.
Oh yeah, big time. And they synergize super well too with Tehenowin. If you take him up in the air, obviously he gives them all poison attacks, and you can summon Manticores, so that kind of gives you two ways. You can support with some of the Lore of Beast spells as well. Whistlin's Wild Form to give him a bit more armor, or if you want physical resistance and extra speed, Pan's Pelt's not a bad choice either. So Tehenowin, especially, supporting the Ripperdactyls, I have personally, I had a Alberic Hippogriff build that just got torn to shreds by Tehenowin and some Ripperdactyls, supporting. So yeah, I definitely think Lizardmen Air Force is going to be something to be reckoned with. And, you could even do something funny like take a High Slon and take Tempest, and then, take maybe some Skink Chiefs supporting Ripperdactyls up in the air. And, there's a lot of, it opens up a lot of possibilities, I guess. And it does mean also that big, scary flyers, things like Karl Franz, you mentioned dragons for the High Elves, or, phoenixes as well, vampire counts with their Terrorgeists and dragons and more. It's going to mean that you can contest that air game a lot better, and those picks aren't going to be as much of auto picks, right? Like previously, Karl Franz was almost an auto pick for me against Lizardmen, whereas now I have to take that into account. Like, oh, if I take Karl Franz and they show up with a nasty Tehenowin Goon Squad with a bunch of Ripperdactyls, I'm going to be in trouble. You know what I mean? So
right.
I like the extra options. Certainly, I think it's a great addition.
Mm-hmm. The most important thing for these DLCs, of course, is making the factions that they target a lot more dynamic, and I'd say that for Skaven and for Lizardmen, that all of these added units play very well into the faction's strengths and also give them, they fill out holes in their roster.
Definitely. It fills out holes in the roster while at the same time sort of staying true to the overall vision of the faction. Like, it doesn't alter their playstyle too much. I would say the Lizardmen changes their playstyle a lot more so than the Skaven. The Skaven are going to be the same sort of playstyle, just a lot more powerful, I think. But the Lizardmen, I mean, of course, the new monsters are right on theme, and just the extra mobility, I think, is really, the fact that the red crested skinks are a bit faster, they have poison. Tehenowin lets you slow things down to your speed with the area of effect poison on your units. The salamanders, even if they aren't wildly useful, they are still pretty quick. Your Ripperdactyls are also very fast. So the addition, I think, for the Lizardmen, the big win is the extra mobility. And just overall, both of these factions, I would say, in a lot better place. We'll see where they end up in the tier list. Out of the two, which do you think? Do you think that one maybe got off better than the other? Do you think that one is maybe going to be higher on the tier list than the other, or do you think they're pretty even?
If I had to say, I think Skaven probably were the big winners of this patch. Of course, this might come from a place of a little bit of bias, but I feel like Lizardmen are more or less the same. I always held the belief that Skaven were just at the ley line of being like a top-tier faction, with exception to the fact that they have a lot of holes in the roster. But now players like Charamis, Morgangrat, who are already very competent with Skaven pre-buff, now having all these new tools available to them for applying counter battery and of course still accentuating what I believe has been somewhat of a horde meta for Warhammer. I think that Skaven will be a little bit better off than Lizardmen, but that's not to say that our cold-blooded friends aren't also going to be showing up high on that tier list. I think they also will be pretty powerful.
Definitely. I agree 100%. I think initially, the Lizardmen, the Skaven they're more clear winners, I would say. The Lizardmen stuff, I think, will take a little bit more time and effort to sort of figure out the nuance of how exactly to make everything work together. I definitely think that they're in a lot better place, certainly, but I do think that the Skaven, their new stuff is a little bit more, I guess, more obvious, if that's the right way to say it. It's a little bit flashier, it's a little bit more upfront, and it's a little bit maybe easier to use. Skaven still, I think, are going to be a faction that does require a good level of micro, just because of that low leadership and some of their other faction mechanics, but I definitely would say I guess they're more clear winners. I guess that'd be a good way of putting it. But
Right.
yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure, AEROCRASTIC. I'll have a link to your Twitch and your YouTube down in the channel below. I don't know if you have been streaming much on Twitch later. I know you did in the past, but yeah, I definitely have enjoyed the few YouTube videos that you have put out. So yeah, big thanks for coming on. Any final words for the people?
Can't really think of much right now, so I suppose I'll have to save it for my next video.
There we go. We'll have to stay tuned for that. Huge thanks once again. Thank you all for joining. If you like this sort of content, be sure to like and subscribe for more, and we'll see you next time.